Excel hell. As an IT professional, you already know all about Excel hell. This is where your business users build endless Excel workbooks, solutions for anything and everything, and then they come to you and they need you to fix them, support them, automate them. They need you to turn these Excel workbooks into real systems as part of your business IT department. This is great right up until you figure out that the solution that these users have implemented is never exactly quite the same thing twice in a row. As the business changes, as their job evolves, so do their workbooks. Every time they run them, it does something different. Every time you talk to them, you get a different story. You can never seem to get all the requirements, so you can build an official solution for these types of applications. Well, if you already know how to use Excel and you already know how to use SQL and SQL Server, I'm going to show you something that will change your life forever. I'm going to show you my secret method that will allow you to integrate your Excel workbooks with your business data directly, turning your Excel workbooks into little applets that can empower you and your users, and you can get things done in ways you just never considered possible. You can tame Excel hell by not replacing it, but rather by integrating your Excel workbooks with your business data rather than building new expensive systems to replace them. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I have a sample worksheet that I put together just to save your time so you don't have to watch me type this stuff. Basically, you have a connection string. Tells you what server you want, tells you what database you want, tells you what username and password. In this case, I'm using integrated security and using my Windows login. I'm using the Northwind database. It's a sample database for SQL Server. If you're watching this, you probably know what the Northwind database is. If not, you can Google it, you can download it, you can install it, and you can use it to do your own samples. But instead of that, just imagine your own data in your own business applications. Now, I have an SQL statement here. Select territory ID and employee ID from the employee territories table, and I want to order this by employee ID for reasons that'll become clear in a minute. Now, here I have a function that references effectively these two cells. Okay, it references my connection string, it references my SQL statement, and then it has a link to this cell B1. That's my trigger cell. I'll tell you that in a second. Basically, if I turn this to 0, it doesn't run the SQL statement. Imagine this query does something pretty big and heavyweight. You want to be able to run it when you want, or not when you want. I can put into here, into this cell, I can put in the current time. Oops. Now every time I calculate the workbook, it's going to run the SQL statement because the time is always changing. Or you can just put a constant 1, so it'll run the first time. I'm going to undo all of this and put it back to my one that it had originally. Now here, I've run the function, it executed the SQL, it went to the server, it got the results, and you're seeing the first row back. Now to see all the data, all you have to do is take this function that's in cell B5 right now. I'm going to highlight a range. Goes down a little ways. I don't know how much data I'm going to get back. Okay, I'm going to hit F2 for edit, and then Control-Shift-Enter. That applies the SQL statement to the range of cells. Now it runs the statement one time, it goes to the server, it gets the data, it brings it back, it puts it into your workbook, and best of all, every time you change the query, boom, there's your data. If I happen to build my function here with a reference to now, every time I calculate the workbook with F8, boom, 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 it goes and runs the query. I get back the data I want. So now, what can we do with this? Imagine we come over here, and the whole purpose of this exercise is that my users need to arbitrarily reassign the territories that they've assigned to the employees they've assigned each territory on a regular basis. So I'm going to go down and I'm going to say, well, let's look at this. Employee 1 only has two territories. I'm going to make this territory belong to employee 1. I'll make that territory belong to employee 1. Now I can come over here and I have an update template. Basically, it's an SQL statement. You should recognize it. I have parameters in it, or tokens, the curly brace 3, curly brace 1, curly brace. Those are going to be replaced by a function called tokenizer, and it's going to pick up values from this range right here. So now I'm going to go into this cell, and I have a formula. The formula one here says I'm going to use tokenizer to take my SQL template and replace the values in it with the values from this range over here. I'm going to have an if statement that says if the new employee is different than the old employee, and if the new employee is present with another if statement. I want to get this SQL statement from the template tokenized, otherwise I want an empty string. Okay, so here we don't have a new employee ID, so I have nothing. But if I make this be 2, now I get an update statement in this cell, and you can see that it wants to do there we go. Update territory set employee ID equals 2, or territory equals this territory. It picks up the data from here. Now I can copy this template all the way down my workbook, as far down as I have data. Okay. Now I get update statements where I need them, where the data doesn't change. I don't get update statements. Once again, the whole thing runs in real time as I change the workbook. Now when I'm all done, what I really want to do is I want to write this data back to my database. Now this demo is going to be very simple. It's just going to basically pull some data back, make some changes, write it to the database. We'll talk about that in a minute. But basically I take this SQL that I generate here, my output template, and I pass it back into the SQL Server exec function. I give it my connection string that I've already given it, and I give it a new trigger cell. In this case, I want to give it G1 as my trigger cell. And it tells me that the trigger is not enabled. Now if I copy this down the column, what you will see is that it tells me my trigger is not enabled. Why is it not enabled? Because I need to make this reference to this cell fixed with F4. Now I've got my formulas. Notice I'm using a fixed reference for the connection string. I've got a fixed reference for these two cells don't move in the workbook, but this reference to the SQL is not fixed, so that when I copy it down the column, it will here it will update from G5 to G7, G8, and so forth. Now turn on my trigger, and I just wrote the data to the workbook. Now when I pull this back, what you're going to see is that I only have one territory for this one right here. If I calculate this, it just fetched it. Now I have more ones. So if I come in and I make some of these 2's be 1's, and I make this one not update, it pulls it back, and now we can see all these 1's in here. So we can see that it's doing the updates into the database as we go. Now, a couple things about this. I use this all the time for doing basically data prep work, where I know I have to get data out of the database. I have to give it to a user who needs to go in and fill in a bunch of stuff in it, and then I have to put it back in the database. I used to spend hours writing SQL statements to make these updates so that I could deploy them through our QA and UAT and production process. It would take hours and hours of my time. Now I give the user a workbook that effectively has the data pulled into it just like this. I copy the values of this to a new range, and I give it to the user, and I say update it how you see fit. Then when I get it back, I add an SQL template. I generate the SQL statements, and oftentimes I will actually copy these out of here and put them into a text editor and run them through a normal software deployment process. I won't actually execute them out of the workbook directly. Often I don't have permission to do that in production, and you probably don't either. But that said, you can. Now, take this one more step down the road. You can imagine all kinds of things you can do with this. I don't have to tell you what business problems your users are struggling with, but imagine that you have an analysis that starts from something very simple like this, It pulls back some other data in another tab of the workbook. Okay, it pulls back some more data in another tab of the workbook. It does some VLOOKUPs. It does some aggregations, some pivot tables. The users do some manual analysis on it. They go look up some market research, and in the end, they end up with a bunch of data here, like several worksheets disconnected from the source data, where they have some primary key of some record and some updated data they have to write back, and you have to put this back into the database. And imagine this is an iterative process. They do this, they write the data, they go back and they start over again. If you do that, what you can do is you can have all this workbook staged from the very beginning, where they trigger the data fetch. Okay, which my trigger is not even active right now. It's coded so it always pulls the data. So it pulls the data every time they calculate the workbook. As they work on the workbook, it keeps pulling the data. I actually prefer not to do this. I actually prefer to point it to a trigger cell, which would be this one. Notice how it says trigger. It doesn't want to pull the data. I tell it OK. Now it pulls the data. Goes to the server and pulls it back. Now on the update side, generally I don't want the trigger enabled. So when they pull the data, they do all their analysis. At the far end of this thing, the users can now put in, and you can help them with this, an exec proc blah at param equals blah. Use stored procedures for this, because you can permission these things and set them up accordingly. But you probably get the idea for what you can do with this. I don't have to make up any stories for all the great things you can do. You already know. You already are suffering at the lack of integration between SQL and Excel. And this little bitty piece of enabling technology is just going to change the way you use SQL Server and the way you use Excel and the things you can teach your users to do in your business environment.